Imagine a man. He comes back from the brink of death and defeats cancer. And then he wins one of the toughest sports in the world for 7 consecutive years. Millions of people believe in him. They don't see him as just a hero, but as a complete miracle. But what if we told you this story was a lie from the very beginning? For years, no one noticed. Or maybe they didn't want to notice. Because sometimes the truth is far more dangerous than what we want to believe. This is the story of Lance Armstrong. Not the rise of a hero. The birth of one of the greatest betrayals in history. Let's begin. Towards the late 1990s, the world of sports witnessed something that seemed too perfect to be real. Lance Armstrong didn't just appear as a successful cyclist. He was presented as a man who had returned from the hands of death. In 1996, when he was diagnosed with testicular cancer, the disease had already spread extensively. It wasn't limited to one area, it had reached his lungs and even his brain. The situation was severe, and this diagnosis threatened not just his career, but his life. From that point on, people were no longer watching an athlete's performance, but a fight for survival. Armstrong underwent surgeries, received intensive treatment, and went through a difficult process that lasted for months. Many believed he would never return to professional sports. Because elite sports require not only talent, but physical integrity, endurance, and a flawless body. Cancer, on the other hand, is a destruction that tears the body apart from within. But precisely because of this, Armstrong's comeback turned into one of the most powerful stories in sports history. People saw what happened as an almost epic victory over death. This perception created extraordinary attention around him. He was no longer just someone who won races. He was someone who had emerged from pain, rejected defeat, and held on to life for a second time. The media amplified this story. Newspapers, magazines, and television programs began to present Armstrong not as an ordinary athlete, but as a symbol of resistance in the modern age. People saw in him not just success, but hope. Because Armstrong's story was saying this, it is possible to come back even from the darkest point. A man who had beaten cancer simply getting back on a bicycle was already inspiring, but his rise to the top of the sport within just a few years made this story even more powerful. Between 1999 and 2005, he officially won the Tour de France 7 times in a row. These victories made him not only the greatest cyclist of his time, but also one of the most extraordinary comeback stories in sports history. But at this point, something very important happened. People didn't just respect Armstrong anymore, they began to believe in him. And sometimes, the belief built around a person becomes far stronger than the truth itself. Yes, that's exactly what happened. He was no longer just someone who won races, but a symbol that millions of people formed an emotional connection with. Cancer patients found motivation in him, sponsors saw him as the perfect brand face, and sports media created an endless legend through his story. Yellow wristbands, charity campaigns, interviews, documentaries, and headlines all came together to create a single image: the unbeatable man. No matter how much pain he endured, he returned. No matter how many blows he took, he always stood up. No matter how difficult the race, he always won in the end. The truth that would emerge later would not just be the fall of an athlete. Because people were not attached to an athlete's performance, but to the existence of a hero. And when a hero collapses, it is not only his career that is destroyed, but also the emotions of millions who believed in him. Lance Armstrong's rise did not remain just a comeback story. It soon turned into one of the greatest winning streaks in sports history. When he won the Tour de France in 1999, this victory alone was already considered a miracle by many. Because a man who had fought death just a few years earlier had now climbed to the top of the toughest race in the world. But what was truly remarkable was that this was only the beginning. Armstrong continued to win in the following years: 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, and 2005. Every year, the same result. Every year, the same success. Every year, the same story: Armstrong was winning. Over time, this stopped being an ordinary achievement and turned into something almost supernatural. Because in a race as difficult as the Tour de France, not only physical endurance, but also luck, strategy, and team dynamics are decisive. Even the strongest athletes struggle to stay at the top every year. But Armstrong seemed to defy this rule. His performance, especially in the mountain stages, became something difficult to explain for many. While his rivals slowed down, he accelerated. At the moments when other athletes reached their limits, it was as if he was just getting started. This was shocking for those watching. But at the same time, it was disturbing for some. Because this performance was pushing all known limits of human physiology. In the world of sports, such extraordinary achievements almost always bring suspicion with them. These suspicions had already begun to emerge for Armstrong. Some journalists, former athletes, and experts were questioning his performance. Especially considering the doping scandals that had previously occurred in cycling, this level of dominance was too striking. However, these suspicions could not reach the wider public. The main reason for this was that Armstrong was not just an athlete, but a story. People wanted to believe in his success. Because this story was not just about winning races, but about a man who had returned from death and climbed back to the top. For this reason, suspicions were often suppressed, ignored, or underestimated. The media also played an important role in this process. Armstrong's achievements were often presented not with a critical perspective, but with admiration. His performance was exaggerated rather than questioned. This created a shield of untouchability around him. Criticism directed at him was often seen as jealousy or bad intentions. Strangely, people began to believe not only that Armstrong was winning, but that he had to win. Because his losing would not just mean the loss of an athlete. It would mean the collapse of a story people had embraced as hope. And that is a very painful feeling. That's why the truth was not questioned. Armstrong's victories grew in this way. Each new success suppressed previous doubts even more. Each new victory strengthened the legend around him further. And in this process, small suspicions quietly disappeared around a larger truth. Because at that point, it was no longer about performance. It was about the continuation of a legend. As time went on, Armstrong's success began to create not only admiration, but also deeper curiosity. Because maintaining such a high level for so long, especially in a sport like cycling where physical limits are constantly pushed, was never something ordinary. However, the real truth of this story was not on the visible surface of the races, but hidden behind the scenes. The world of cycling had actually been associated with doping allegations for years. Since the 1990s, many teams and athletes had been accused of using performance-enhancing substances. Among these substances, a hormone called EPO stood out in particular. EPO increased the oxygen-carrying capacity of the blood, allowing athletes to perform at high levels for longer periods. In addition, methods such as blood doping and testosterone were also widely used. However, when these substances were used with the right timing and methods, they became very difficult to detect in tests. This is exactly where Armstrong's story differed from the others. This was not simple doping use. It was carried out in an extremely organized and planned manner. Armstrong had a team managing this process. Doctors, trainers, and team managers were all part of this system. Everything was planned in advance: which substance would be taken at which time, how the race calendar would be handled, when tests would occur. Everything was within a plan. These details were not random, but strategically determined. Athletes' blood values were constantly monitored, and risks were calculated in advance. When necessary, even blood transfusions were carried out, and values were manipulated before tests. This system was so professionally built that no serious evidence was found for years. Armstrong's success could not be explained by physical performance alone, it was also the result of systematic planning. However, the strongest aspect of this system was not the technical details, but the deep silence. Because this structure was protected not only by scientific methods, but also by human factors. Not speaking within the team was an unwritten rule. Everyone knew exactly what they were a part of, but no one openly spoke about it. At this point, Armstrong's role was not limited to being an athlete. He was also the central figure of this system. With both his performance and authority, he kept this structure intact. He had a strong influence over his teammates. His leadership was not only about race strategies, but also about maintaining this system. Therefore, Armstrong's story cannot be seen as just an individual success or violation. It reflected the sports culture of an entire era. Because in those years, doping in cycling was not an exception, but almost part of the system. But Armstrong's difference was that he was the one who used this system best and hid it the longest. That is why his story carried a much greater meaning than an ordinary doping scandal. It was a significant example of how an organized deception was presented as a flawless success story. And this deception involved not only his competitors, but millions of people. But every story that appears perfect contains a breaking point waiting to emerge one day. For Lance Armstrong, this breaking point began when suspicions that had been suppressed for years could no longer be ignored. At first, the claims seemed small, but over time they became more visible. Former teammates began to speak. Testimonies that had previously been silenced or not taken seriously started to surface one by one. Anti-doping agencies began to re-examine past data, and the pieces slowly came together. From this point on, the issue was no longer just an athlete's performance, but the exposure of a system that had been maintained for years. Of course, Armstrong denied these accusations for a long time. He defended himself publicly, rejected the allegations, and tried to protect his story. But the truth had grown too large to be controlled. In 2012, decisions were made to strip Armstrong of all his Tour de France victories. The titles he had won over the years were erased. His achievements in sports history were wiped out one by one. This was not only shocking for an athlete, but for the history of sports itself. Because this was not just about an athlete who had broken the rules, this was about a massive lie sustained for years in front of the entire world. The most striking moment of this process came in 2013. In an interview with famous television host Oprah Winfrey, Armstrong finally admitted the truth he had denied for years. He confessed that he had used doping repeatedly. This confession was a breaking point for millions of people. Because this was not just the admission of a crime, it was the destruction of a legend. People had believed in him for years. They had been inspired by his story. The comeback of a man who had beaten cancer had become hope for many. But now, the truth revealed that this hope had largely been built on a lie. That is why Armstrong's fall was so devastating. Because people did not just lose an athlete. They lost a story they had believed in. At this point, the word betrayal took on a much deeper meaning. Because this was not just a violation of sports rules. It was a ruthless betrayal against people's emotions, hopes, and beliefs. Armstrong's story showed how thin the line between success and deception can be. It also proved that no matter how high a person rises, the truth will eventually come out. Today, the name Lance Armstrong is still remembered. But no longer as a hero. He is remembered as the central figure of one of the greatest controversies in sports history. And perhaps the most striking part of this story is this: people still remember his achievements, but now they also know the truth behind them. That is why Armstrong's story is not just a story of downfall, it is one of the greatest narratives of betrayal in history, showing how a legend is created and how it is destroyed.